Brussels promised to wean Europe off Chinese supply chains. Instead, German firms just invested $7 billion into China in 2025, a record. While the EU tariffed Chinese EVs, European carmakers are losing market share and racing back to Beijing to survive. How did Europe's de-risking agenda collapse in 1 year? The answer is written in German corporate ledgers, not EU policy papers. In November 2024, Brussels did something it had spent 2 decades refusing to do. It slapped tariffs on Chinese electric cars. The vote split Europe down the middle. France pushed for them. The Netherlands and Denmark sided with Paris. Germany voted against. Spain abstained. And when the result came back, the EU did something stranger still. It gave the move a name: de-risking. The official strategy of an entire continent, written into policy, was to need China less. Here is why that matters to anyone who has never read a trade brief. Almost everything in your kitchen, half of what's in your driveway, and most of the chip in your phone runs through a Chinese supply chain. The solar panel on your neighbor's roof, the battery feeding your e-bike, magnets spinning inside every washing machine on the street. When Europe says it wants to depend on China less, it is talking about the physical world you live in. So the question hanging over everything you are about to hear is simple. 18 months on, did any of it work? We'll see exactly how that promise unraveled and where the money actually went. Spoiler, it was not where Brussels wanted. That promise had a price tag. In December 2025, the European Commission rolled out something called RE-Source-EU, a plan to mobilize €3 billion and cut Europe's reliance on single suppliers by 30 to 50%. The deadline was 2029. The targets were batteries, rare earths, and the metals that go inside missiles, jets, and radar. The plan even invented a new phrase for its diplomats: raw materials, diplomacy, code for flying to Africa and Latin America with a checkbook, trying to lock in mines before Beijing did. On paper, it looked decisive. €3 billion, strategic stockpiles, demand pooled across 27 countries so no single buyer could be picked off. Then, in February 2026, the European Court of Auditors filed its own quiet verdict. Despite every target, despite every press release, the EU remained, in their own words, dangerously dependent on countries outside the bloc. €3 billion against the largest industrial machine in human history. Even the people in charge of measuring the project were warning that the gap was not closing fast enough. Which raises the harder question: China is impossible to peel away from. And the reason is not what most people imagine. The real answer is uglier. Start with the wages, and you only see a third of it. Yes, Chinese factory pay is lower than German pay, but that explains only part of the gap. The rest comes from something economists call agglomeration. Stack one battery factory next to another. Then add the cathode plant next door. Then the separator film maker across the street. Then the lithium refiner half a mile away. And suddenly, every link in the chain is faster, cheaper, and less prone to delays. China has spent 30 years building entire cities around that idea. Shenzhen built itself around electronics. Chongqing became one giant auto plant. Yixing turned into the solar capital. Layer on state credit at near zero interest, land handed over for free, and pollution rules. Europe simply will not match. And the cost structure that comes out the other end is one no German factory can touch. The research is blunt about the timeline. On current trends, the gap holds for at least the next 5 to 10 years. Meanwhile, European manufacturers carry stricter labor rules, stricter environmental rules, and an energy bill that has roughly doubled since the war in Ukraine started. Build a battery plant in Bavaria, and you are racing a car with the handbrake on. Build it in Anhui, and the state pays for the asphalt. That is the wall Brussels is trying to climb. And the first place it cracked was the one industry Europe thought it owned. That industry was electric vehicles, and the crack hit the data first. In 2025, global EV registrations surged 32.9%. Then the forecast collapses, just 5.9% growth penciled in for 2026. The cliff is not a blip. It is the moment European carmakers needed China most. With sales stalling at home and Chinese rivals doubling their European market share to 11%, the only place left to make money was Beijing. Which is exactly where the Chancellor flew. In February 2026, Friedrich Merz landed in Beijing, and the language he used told the whole story. Merz had campaigned on a tougher China line. He arrived speaking softer. The word rival vanished from his speeches. The phrase he reached for instead was partnership. The shift was deliberate because behind the Chancellor sat the largest single block of German industry. The numbers they were tracking told the real story. German direct investment into China hit 7 billion euros in just the first 11 months of 2025, one of the highest figures on record. Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW, every name that defines the German export miracle, was doubling down on China. CATL, China's biggest battery maker, had already poured 1.8 billion euros into a factory in Thuringia. The flag on the wall was German. The technology, the supply chain, the parent company, Chinese. So while Brussels wrote tariff policy, Berlin wrote checks. Every check cut against the official strategy. Germany was the single largest break inside the EU on tougher China measures, and the reason was not ideology. It was money already in the ground, decades of investment. Plants Berlin cannot walk away from, which sets up the real bottleneck. Because even if Europe sourced raw materials from anywhere else on Earth, one step in the chain still belongs to China. That step is refining. You can dig lithium out of the ground in Australia, copper in Chile, cobalt in the Congo, and almost all of it still ends up on a boat to China. Beijing controls between 60 and 80% of the world's refining capacity. That is the choke point. Europe cannot route around. The Critical Raw Materials Act, passed in 2024, set targets for extraction, processing, and recycling by 2030. The targets were the easy part. The factories are not built yet. Take Jadar, what was supposed to be Europe's largest lithium project, planted in western Serbia, backed by Rio Tinto. In 2025, after years of public protests over water contamination, the Serbian government shelved it. Years of planning, hundreds of millions in capex, gone. Germany's Vulcan Energy project, designed to refine lithium straight from geothermal brine beneath the Rhine Valley, is the most promising European alternative. It will not start production until 2028 at the earliest, 3 years from now. Meanwhile, every electric vehicle Europe builds, every wind turbine spinning off the North Sea, every guided weapon ordered by Brussels still passes through a Chinese refinery. The metal can come from anywhere. The refining still happens in one country. And as the next EU-China summit approached in 2026, that single fact was about to define the entire negotiation. As the next round of talks opens, the leverage Brussels thought it held has already drained away. 18 months after the tariff vote that opened this story, the numbers had moved. But not in the direction Brussels wanted. Chinese car makers' share of the European market had doubled. German investment in China had hit a record. The flagship lithium project for the whole bloc was shelved. The refining bottleneck Beijing controls, still untouched. As tariff talks resume, every channel of leverage Europe thought it had built is being quietly traded for breathing room. The original tariffs are already being watered down into minimum price agreements, softer and smaller, and a lot less embarrassing for German exporters. 3 billion euros was meant to start a continental industrial pivot. On the trend, the data shows it bought a press release. Here is the through line. The numbers expose. Brussels announced de-risking. Berlin financed deeper integration with China. Beijing kept refining the metal. And every step Europe took to escape the dependency ended up cementing it. The strategic cost is not measured in euros. It is measured in autonomy, the freedom to act when Beijing makes a move Europe does not like. The data we reviewed projects that by the 2030s, on current trends, that freedom will be narrower than when this whole project began. Which leaves one question for the continent that invented modern industry. If you cannot make the metal, the magnet, or the motor, who actually owns your factory? Europe's dependence on China just got worse, not better. Like, share, and subscribe. See you tomorrow.